Welcome back to the Josh Scanlon Podcast, episode 108, I believe, and it's November 3rd, 2018. And this is going to be part two of our discussion, our reading from the Sugar Conspiracy article from 2016 by a man named Ian Leslie. And I'm a huge fan of this article, and you should be too. So we're going to start back on part two. If you haven't heard part one, please go back and listen. Actually, while I was taking a break, getting another cup of coffee, I went and I just did some research on Ancel Keys, just real quick on Wikipedia, nothing huge, but because Ancel Keys, actually, in my opinion, is horrifically responsible for the obesity that we're finding in the United States across the board. And I don't know if this has anything to do with the increase in allergies, and I don't know. I don't know. But the facts are we have an obese society for sure, and it's attributed to diet more than being sedentary, which is sitting on your butt and playing video games. It's a diet, man. It's a diet. So you can exercise all day long, but if your diet is bad, the exercise is not bad for you. No one's going to say exercise is bad, but it's the diet that drives everything for sure. But it's interesting about Keys. So he was born in Colorado Springs. His family moved to San Francisco and right before the earthquake, and after the disaster, they relocated to Berkeley, where Ancel Keys grew up. Now, remember, Ancel Keys is the proponent of the anti-fat study that says don't do cholesterol whatsoever. And remember, Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack in 1955, and his doctors told the world, the U.S., but says, give up cholesterol, don't smoke. And that's what Eisenhower did. I don't know if he smoked, but he gave up cholesterol and anything with high fats. And then he subsequently died of a heart attack in 1969. And his doctor was using the research of Ancel Keys as a reason for his recommendation for Dwight Eisenhower to get his heart back in shape, because Ancel Keys' research. And since then, it's basically a three-headed monster. You had Eisenhower's doctor, Dr. Dudley, and then Ancel Keys were really the advocates, and they're just destroying all comers for the low fat intake of your diet, which has since led to this epidemic of obesity, without question. All right. But it's interesting. So Keys is actually an interesting guy. He was identified in high school as intellectually gifted. During his youth, though, he left high school to pursue odd jobs, such as shoveling bat guano in Arizona, a powder monkey in a Colorado mine. He worked in a lumber camp and as a crew member on a ship to China. That's pretty interesting. He eventually finished his secondary education and was admitted to California, Berkeley, where he initially studied chemistry, but was dissatisfied and took some time off to work as an oiler aboard the SS President Wilson, which traveled to China. He then returned to Berkeley, switched majors, and graduated with a BA in economics and political science and a master's in zoology. All right, so his main background is politics. For a brief time, he took a job as a management trainee at Woolworths, but returned to his studies at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla. In 1930, he received his PhD in oceanography and biology from Berkeley. He was then awarded the National Research Council Fellowship that took him to Copenhagen to study under August Krogh at the Zoology Laboratory for 2 years. During his studies with Krogh, he finished fish physiology and contributed numerous papers on the subject of fish physiology. Okay. Once his fellowship ended, he went to Cambridge, but took some time off to teach at Harvard, after which he returned to Cambridge and earned a second PhD in physiology. The interesting thing here, though, is he's the reason we have K rations. In 1936, Keys was offered a position at the Mayo Foundation, where he continued to study physiology. He left after a year, citing an intellectually stifling environment where research was secondary to clinical doc business and playing bridge. Isn't that interesting? So he's complaining of intellectually stifling, and yet he was doing the same thing to our man John Yudkin, a hero in our story. In 1937, he left the Mayo Foundation to teach physiology at Minnesota, where he founded the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene. His earlier research on human physiology eventually led to an assignment with the Army Quartermaster Corps, where they worked to develop a more portable and non-perishable ration that would provide enough calories to sustain soldiers in the field for up to 2 weeks. The development did not begin without some turbulence. His colleague, Dr. Ellsworth Buskirk, says, quote, when it appeared that the U.S. would be in World War II, Keyes went to the Quartermaster Food and Container Institute in Chicago to inquire about emergency rations. The story goes that he was told to go home and leave such things to professionals. Undissuaded, he went to William Wrigley's office and secured $10,000 for the development of emergency ration. Then he went to the Cracker Jack Company. They couldn't supply the money, but did provide the watertight small box concept. The result was a K ration and sealed Cracker Jack boxes. Man, that's pretty interesting. There's no evidence that the K ration necessarily is devoted to Keyes, but that's what we think. So anyway, let's go back to the Arthur. That's pretty interesting. It sounds like an interesting guy, actually. I mean, my goodness, going on an oil to China. But at the end of the day, I just chuckled at he left the Mayo Institute because of stifling intellect, and yet that was he was doing. All right, so here we go. Part 2 of the Ian Leslie, the sugar conspiracy article. In a series of densely argued articles and books, including Why We Get Fat in 2010, the science writer Gary Taubes has assembled a critique of contemporary nutrition science. Powerful enough to compel the field to listen. Now, remember, going back to the first episode here, we talked about what Max Planck had mentioned, that basically science isn't to change people's opinions. You're not going to get people to see the light. The older opinions makers are going to have to die off. That's what Max Planck said. And we actually have studies that confirm that, absolutely. The truth of Planck's maxim. So now Gary Taubes comes around in 2010, where Ancel Keys and many of his junior proponents are essentially dead. And so now the field has been left more wide open to a different, basically unorthodox opinion. Blasphemy, if you will, if you look at from the Ancel Keys perspective. But because Ancel Keys is dead and many of his proponents are as well, there are new people coming to the mainstream, in this case, Gary Taubes. Who have enough chops in which to say, hey, there's a different side to this, and it just opens up a different lane for other people to think differently and still maintain their street cred in the business, so to speak. Anyway, one of Taubes' contributions has been to uncover a body of research conducted by German and Austrian scientists before the Second World War, which had been overlooked by the Americans who reinvented the field in the 1950s, i.e. Ancel Keys, Dwight Eisenhower, and Dr. Dudley. The Europeans were practicing physicians and experts in the metabolic system. The Americans were more likely to be epidemiologists laboring in relative ignorance of biochemistry and endocrinology, the study of hormones. This led to some of the foundational mistakes of modern nutrition. And don't forget, Ancel Keys had a BA in economics and political science. And he has a PhD in physiology, but that's his initial thing was studying of fish physiology. Just again, okay. The rise and slow fall of cholesterol's infamy is a case in point. After it was discovered inside the arteries of men who had suffered heart attacks, public health officials advised by scientists put eggs whose yolks are rich in cholesterol on the danger list. But it's a biological error to confuse what a person puts in their mouth with what it becomes after it is swallowed. The human body, far from being a passive vessel for whatever we choose to fill it with, is a busy chemical plant, transforming and redistributing the energy it receives. Its governing principle is homeostasis, or the maintenance of energy equilibrium. When exercise heats up, sweat cools us down. Cholesterol present in all of our cells is created by the liver. Biochemists had long known that the more cholesterol you eat, the less your liver produces. So cholesterol is created by the liver. You eat more cholesterol, the less your liver produces. Unsurprisingly, then, repeated attempts to prove a correlation between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol have failed. For the vast majority of people, eating 2 or 3 or 25 eggs a day does not significantly raise cholesterol levels. One of the most nutrient-dense, versatile, and delicious foods are eggs, and we have needlessly stigmatized them. The health authorities have spent the last few years slowly backing away from this mistake, presumably in the hope that if no sudden movements are made, nobody will notice. In a sense, they have succeeded. A survey carried out in 2014 by Credit Suisse found that 54% of U.S. doctors believe that dietary cholesterol raises blood cholesterol. To his credit, Ansel Keys realized early that dietary cholesterol was not a problem. But in order to sustain his assertion that cholesterol causes heart attacks, he needed to identify an agent that raises its levels in the blood, basically raising blood cholesterol. And he landed on saturated fats. So again, he realizes that you can eat 25 eggs a day. It's not going to raise your cholesterol because your liver will not produce anything because you're getting enough inside you. But then, so he realized that dietary, what you eat, i.e. eggs and cholesterol, is not a problem. But what it is what is raising your blood cholesterol is what Ansel Keys would say would be saturated fats. In the 30 years after Eisenhower's heart attack, trial after trial failed to conclusively bear out the association he claimed to have identified in the 7-country study. The nutritional establishment wasn't greatly discomforted by the absence of a definitive proof. But in 1993, it found it couldn't evade another criticism. While a low-fat diet had been recommended to women, it never tested on them, a fact that is astonishing only if you are not a nutrition scientist. So they recommended a low-fat diet to women, but they never made a test on women. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute decided to go all in, commissioning the largest controlled trial of diets ever undertaken. As well as addressing the other half of the population, the Women's Health Initiative was expected to obliterate any lingering doubts about the ill effects of fat. It did nothing of the sort. At the end of the trial, it was found that women on the low-fat diet were no less likely than the control group to contract cancer or heart disease. This caused much consternation. The principal's researcher, unwilling to accept the implication of his own findings, remarked, "We are scratching our heads over some of these results." A consensus quickly formed that the study, meticulously planned and lavishly funded, overseen by impressively credentialed researchers, must have been flawed so much as to be meaningless. The field moved on, or rather it did not. In 2008, researchers from Oxford undertook a European-wide study of the causes of heart disease. Its data shows an inverse correlation between saturated fat and heart disease. Across the continent, France, the country with the highest intake of saturated fat, has the lowest rate of heart disease. Ukraine, the country with the lowest intake of saturated fat, has the highest. When the British obesity researcher Zoe Harcombe performed an analysis of the data on cholesterol levels in 192 countries around the world, she found out that lower cholesterol correlated with higher rates of death from heart disease. In the last 10 years, a theory that had somehow held up unsupported for nearly 50 years has been rejected by comprehensive evidence reviews, even though it staggers on, zombie-like, in our dietary guidelines and medical advice. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, in a 2008 analysis of all studies of the low-fat diet, found no probable or convincing evidence that a high level of dietary fat causes heart disease or cancer. Another landmark review, published in 2010 in the American Society for Nutrition, authored by, among others, Ronald Cross, a highly respected researcher and physician at the University of California, stated, "There's no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease." Many nutritionists refuse to accept these conclusions. The journal that published Cross's review, wary of outrage among its readers, prefaced it with a rebuttal by a former right-hand man of Ansel Keys, which implied that since Cross's findings contradicted every national international dietary recommendation, they must be flawed. The circular logic is symptomatic of a field with an unusually high propensity for ignoring evidence that does not fit its wisdom. So basically, the rebuttal to Cross's study that says saturated fat does not cause coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease, the rebuttal is, well, your study must be flawed because all the international and national dietary recommendations throughout the world say it does. Okay, but why do they say it does? Because they were using flawed research to begin with. Gary Taubes is a physicist by background. In physics, he told me, you look for the anomalous result. Then you have something to explain. In nutrition, the game is to confirm what you and your predecessors have already believed. As one nutritionist explained to Nina Teichholz with delicate understatement, scientists believe that saturated fat is bad for you, and there's a good deal of reluctance toward accepting evidence to the contrary. When obesity started to become recognized as a problem in Western societies, it was blamed on saturated fats. It was not difficult to persuade the public that if we eat fat, we will be fat. This is a trick of the language. We call an overweight person fat. We don't describe a person with a muscular body, though, as proteiny. The scientific rationale was also pleasingly simple. A gram of fat has twice as much calories as a gram of protein or carbohydrate. And we can all grasp the idea that if a person takes in more calories than he expends in physical activity, the surplus ends up as fat. But simple does not mean correct. It is difficult to square this theory with the dramatic rise. Let me make sure I'm still, with the dramatic rise in obesity since 1980. In America, average calorific intake increased by just a sixth over that period. In the UK, it actually fell. So in the UK, over the last 40 years or 50 years, they're eating less calories. In America, we just increased it by a sixth, not a huge amount. There has been no commensurate decline in physical activity in either country either. In the UK, exercise levels have increased over the last 20 years. Obesity is a problem in some of the poorest parts of the world, even among communities in which food is scarce. Controlled trials have repeatedly failed to show that people lose weight on low-fat or low-calorie diets over the long term. Those pre-war European researchers would have regarded the idea that obesity results from excess calories as laughably simplistic. Biochemists are more likely to think of obesity as a hormonal disorder triggered by the kinds of foods we started eating a lot more when we cut back on fat, easily digestible starches and sugars. In his book, Always Hungry, David Ludwig, an endocrinologist and professor of pediatrics at Harvard, calls this insulin carbohydrate model of obesity. According to this model, an excess of the refined carbohydrates interferes with the self-balancing equilibrium of the metabolic system.